Hi, this is Leonel Castillo. I'm with the Small Farm Outreach Program, and I would just like to say that I am very happy to be working with For the Soil, and I am all for soil conservation and hope that everybody follows our podcast. Thank you.
Hey everybody, I'm Jeff Ishee, host of For the Soil, a conversation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this podcast, and we have a very interesting guest for you today. Eric Bendfeldt and I will be joined by Nicolette Niman. Nicolette is the author of a brand new book called Defending Beef. She is a former vegetarian, former activist, former lawyer. She is extremely interesting, and she has written a brand new book about defending the beef industry, and she is a cattle rancher now, former vegan turned cattle rancher. I think you'll find her extremely interesting as well. Let's go to the show. All right, and we're in Weir's Cave, Virginia today at the Winter Grazing Conference for the Virginia Forage and Grasslands Council. Eric, we have a very special guest with us today.
Yes, Jeff, we're pleased to have Nicolette Hahn Niman with us today, and she's given some presentations here at the Virginia Forage and Grassland Council Conference and has written a couple of books on the whole idea of the importance of beef and livestock in operations in the landscape, and is going to be sharing with us about ecological health and human health and how important soil is to that. So we're really pleased to have Nicolette with us.
Nicolette, it is a real pleasure to have you here in Virginia. You're not from Virginia. You're from Michigan, I believe.
Yes, but although I just realized, I was thinking about the other day as I was driving around the state, my mother is from Germany, and she arrived in Norfolk, Virginia. So I do have a connection here, a family connection. But I'm originally from Michigan, grew up there, and I've lived in North Carolina for a couple years as well. So I know the landscape a little bit from that. And I've been in California. I lived in New York for 5 years, but now I've been in California for 18 years. So that's mostly, where I've been for the last couple decades.
Talk to me about Defending Beef. This is a book that was recently revised.
Yes, I spent about a year revising it. I originally wrote it about 8 years ago because I heard so much criticism of cattle and beef. And I had a background as an environmental lawyer. I understood the environmental arguments really well. But what I was seeing on our own ranch and a lot of other ranches was not at all what I was hearing in the public conversation about beef. And the sort of the benefits, the side that, the ecosystem services, that what it is that it helps the environment to have these grazing animals on the land. I wasn't hearing about that, in the mainstream media. And I wasn't hearing about beef as a healthy food. I was hearing about it being bad for our health. And I didn't believe that because humans have been eating meat for 3 million years. It was not logical to me to believe that meat was unhealthy. So I began doing a lot of research. I spent several years researching it, and I wrote a book called Defending Beef. And then a few years ago, my publisher came to me and said, well, we need you to revise and update that book, and I jumped at the chance. So I spent about a year reworking the book, and this past year, the new version of Defending Beef has come out, and the subtitle is The Ecological and Nutritional Case for Meat.
Eric, do you have any questions specifically for Nicolette?
Well, with that, Nicolette, one of the principles that we're emphasizing is the idea to energize the system with diversity, and within that, the importance of integrating livestock as well as different crops and the importance of rotations. And I think that goes well with your presentation.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There are grazing animals add a lot of flexibility and a lot of value to farms and ranches. They can be on non-farmable land, which is a really important way that grazing animals exist in much of the world and much of the U.S., in fact, as well. But they can also be part of a multi-different farm product type rotation where you have crops and you have maybe cover crops and you have maybe animals grazing those cover crops or just grasses integrated. into the rotation. And I think what we're, increasingly seeing, I really believe this is starting to take hold, is this idea that if we make our farms look more like natural ecosystems, we're going to end up with healthier animals, healthier plant crops, and ultimately healthier communities and healthier people. So that's kind of the sort of really short version of explaining what my book is about, is explaining that these grazing animals help us get closer to farm systems that look more like natural systems, and using those animals to jumpstart the soil biology, which ends up having all kinds of benefits. It makes the water systems cleaner. It makes the soils hold more water. It makes the soil more biologically active, which means that the plants that grow there have more nourishment. More nourishment if they're directly consumed by humans, more nourishment if they're consumed by animals, and then consumed by humans. So it's just something that, nobody was thinking about this a few decades ago in agriculture, and I think there's more and more conversation about it now. And I think that's a really good thing.
You opened your presentation with a very interesting slide, and you said it was presented to a 5th grade class in an elementary school, and it just pictured a Holstein cow and a car. Talk about that slide.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have noticed that there's this constant discussion about climate change and environmental issues where we say, we have all these machines, we have cars especially, and they're harming the environment. And then we have cows, and they're doing that too. And I started realizing, I got to address that directly. A cow is not a car, because a car is a human-built machine, and it's easy to understand and to measure the inputs and the outputs. That is not true for living organisms in living systems. And when we start really digging into the complexity a little bit, we realize that cattle and all the living entities on a farm, they have tons and tons of interrelationships with each other, and there's complexity to it. And we need to think about all of what we're raising on farms as living organisms in living systems, and try to understand the relationships and the connections and create healthy systems.
So it's all about integration and then properly managing that integration.
Yeah, that's why I love to say it's not the cow. It's the how. So the how is the management. The cow can be destructive if not properly managed, but she can also be extremely beneficial. In fact, I would argue that if you don't have livestock in your agricultural operation, almost wherever you are and whatever you're doing, you're probably not getting the full ecological benefit that you could be getting. And that there's almost always going to be a benefit to having livestock in your system. The more complex, every natural system, let's just put it this way, every single natural system in the world has animals in it of all different shapes and sizes, even the microscopic ones, right? And the more that we make our systems complex, and the more that we have biological activity happening, the healthier our whole system's going to be, the more resilient it's going to be, okay? And so we want to have, as much as we can, animals integrated into livestock. And we want to have lots of livestock. We don't want to get rid of the livestock. That doesn't lead to healthier farming systems, and it doesn't lead to healthier diets.
Within that, you had also talking about complexity, and we're also, seeing weather variability or occasional extreme weather events. And in this day and time, we seem to tend to gravitate to extremes. I don't know if you could speak about the importance of moderation as well within a system.
Yeah, well, I think everything is about balance. I think that's the key word that I've learned from my research. And I really appreciate the work of Dr. Jonathan Lundgren, for example, who's, formerly was at USDA for a long time, and he's a soil scientist and an entomologist. And he says if you have, for example, something that you consider a pest on your farm or ranch, either a plant or an insect, it probably is an indication that your system is out of balance. And we've taken an approach in agriculture for a long time like, oh, we have this bad plant or we have this bad insect, we got to stomp it out. Well, that's kind of like trying to diminish life, and it's trying to just, it's like that whack-a-mole thing. You hit it one thing, something else is going to pop up. He says you need to focus on restoring balance. And I love that. I think that is the key concept. We need to have lots of different elements to what we're doing. We need to try to make everything as complex as possible and as biologically vibrant as possible, and focus rather than trying to kill individual things that we think are bad, but how do we get more proliferation of diversity and things that are good and create balance?
It's funny that you mentioned whack-a-mole because there was a graphic slide that you had in your presentation. It showed all this diversity underneath the soil, and when I saw a mole, I had to giggle because at my house, it's a war on moles.
I know. Although, you know what? We have a huge proliferation right now in California of gophers, okay? Because there's been so much dry weather for so long, and they do really well in that. So we have this over-proliferation. And we have a constant conversation about, well, should we be doing more about the moles? And one thing, because they really, the gophers, they really damage the soil structure and the soil and the vegetation, and it's very tempting to start thinking we got to engage in war on the gophers. But one thing we've noticed, we have a lot of raptors, we have owls, ospreys, we have a ton of hunting birds, we have herons, egrets, lots and lots of them on our ranch. And one thing we noticed is we always have great horned owls nesting on our ranch, and this year, for the first time, the entire family of great horned owls that was born, they're all still there. They're still there, every single one of them. You know why? Because they are eating those gophers. There's food for them. So the system is naturally balancing itself out again. We have a lot more than just that one family of great horned owls, but they are, to me, the fact that they didn't have to spread themselves out to find food. They're finding everything they need right there on our ranch. It's because we have the gophers. Well, they're going to eat the gophers, and the gophers are going to go down, and it's going to help restore balance. So sometimes these ideas take patience, and sometimes it's hard to see the solution. It's not the quick fix. It's the long-term approach. And trying to, again, think of how do I have a healthy ecosystem on my farm where the nature is going to balance itself out over time.
Eric, just about a minute and a half or so left in this episode of For the Soil, a conversation. Any final question you have for Nicolette?
I think it'd probably be a question for another episode on human health, the aspects of, there's a lot of interest in how does soil health relate to human health. I think there's also interest in, how we care for our livestock and animals, what that relationship is to human health, nutritional health, as well as community health. And I really appreciate you emphasizing how important it is to both rural and urban communities.
Well, there's a very strong connection between what we're doing on our farms and human health. So, of course, there are the people that are living on the farms. We have to worry about their health. And then there's that larger question of what kind of food are we producing and what kind of food are Americans eating right now? And is the way we're farming fully supporting human health? And what I've been researching for the last couple decades is how our farm systems have gotten more and more focused on production, and we're subsidizing, as a nation, we've been subsidizing a lot of production of very simple, large monocrop things like wheat and soy, and corn. And unfortunately, more and more of our modern diet is based on processed foods that are made with those kind of raw ingredients. And we have moved away from a really nutrient-rich diet that our ancestors, or not even that long ago, maybe our grandparents were eating, right? They might have had some potatoes and some something green maybe, and then a piece of meat, right? And that's a really healthy diet, actually. That's a diet that has a lot of nutrients in it. It has a lot of vitamins. It has a lot of minerals. It has a lot of protein. And more importantly, protein, vitamins, and minerals that our bodies can readily use, okay? Very absorbable, very available, bioavailable. And what's happening is in the U.S. and throughout the industrialized world, people have transitioned to eating more and more processed food. And when I was doing the research for my book, Defending Beef, originally I thought, Well, I'm going to kind of argue why we need to have, meat and milk and eggs in the human diet, because these are rich sources of protein and minerals and vitamins. And I realized the more I worked on it and thought about it and looked at what people are actually eating today, the real question is, how much processed food are you eating? Okay? And if you're eating let's say a Cliff Bar, I hate to pick on one individual company, but it's a good example. It's sort of thought of as a healthy food, but it's really a highly processed food with a lot of processed ingredients, and it's got a lot of sweetener in it. And so that's, one of these kind of like energy bars or something, to me, is a good example of what is wrong with the way people are eating today. And I think this big shift that's happened towards processed foods and away from real whole foods that our grandparents would have been eating, and definitely our ancestors for thousands of years before that would have been eating, is that we've moved away from foods where there's a lot of nourishment for every calorie. So now we eat a lot of bread, crackers, cookies, chips, energy bars, pasta even. I mean, I like pasta. I'm not saying never eat pasta. But if you look at your diet and you ask yourself, how much nourishment is contained in every calorie? Okay? So a calorie, some people think that's nourishment. It's not really. That's just a calorie. That's just energy. Your body needs a ton of nutrients. And if you're putting a lot of food into your body that has a high number of calories but doesn't have a lot of actual nutrients in it, you're going to start having a lot of health problems, because you're going to get overweight, you're going to end up with diabetes. So to me, meat, and especially meat that's raised on, or not just meat, milk, and eggs, especially if it is raised on grass, that is the kind of food we need to have more and more of in our modern diet. We need to rediscover that food as a really important source of nourishment. Okay, so we got to stop thinking about calories so much and start thinking about nourishment. And when you do that, you immediately see how valuable the meat, milk, and eggs is to the human diet.
And we will continue our conversation with Nicolette Niman. Eric Bendfeldt and I have a lot of questions for Nicolette about soil health, about her new book called Defending Beef, and that will be in the next episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. Well, with each episode, we like to highlight some of the core principles of soil health, and today we hear from Dr. Rory McGuire at Virginia Tech.
Keeping the soil covered is very important in terms of preventing soil erosion. Soil erosion is one of the biggest ways to decrease soil quality. If you lose the soil, you're losing the valuable part of your land. So keeping the soil covered prevents soil erosion. And when raindrops directly impact the soil, they can form a crust on the soil surface. They actually break the soil structure right at the soil surface. And once the soil structure is broken at the surface, you don't get any infiltration of water anymore. And of course, if water doesn't infiltrate, it runs off. And when it runs off, it takes the soil with it. So keeping the soil covered is extremely important in terms of preventing surface crust formation and soil erosion.
Dr. Rory McGuire, professor at the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences at Virginia Tech. For the Soil, a Conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. And if you have a specific question about soil health, just contact your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a soil and water conservation district office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts and Mr. Ruiz. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee.